Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Connected Data's live webinar on Transporter, the secure and private alternative to Dropbox. My name is Samina Sibidar. I'm the Senior Channel Marketing Manager at Connected Data. And our presenter for today will be Tony Campbell, who's our Senior Director of Product Marketing. The agenda for today will be Dropbox, what's happening today in the market, what our business is doing about it today. Tony will then go over the Transporter product overview and how Transporter works. We'll have a summary slide, and at the end we will have a short Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them up on your sidebar, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. Here you go, Tony.
Thank you, Samina. And thank you, everybody, for joining today's webinar. So as Samina mentioned, we're going to be talking about how Transporter is a secure and private alternative to Dropbox. And we're also going to delve into the fact that you can use your existing NAS infrastructure as well. So let's talk about what's happening in the market today. So there's been a lot of publicity lately about how Secure really is a public cloud provider. There's been headlines, and here's just a few of them that we've seen about how Dropbox may be looking at an organization's files, whether or not there's really security and true privacy, and the fact that Dropbox stumbles over some of the secret links. The FBI and maybe some other government organizations have asked companies like Google to hand over private customer data. We've all heard in the press about how China continues to put a privacy wall up around the country because they don't want their people to see what's really going on in the world. And also Microsoft has also been asked to turn over data. I think I've also heard that AT&T and some other organizations also. So the reality is, if you don't own your own data, if somebody else is hosting it for you, such as a Dropbox, it's open to be handed over to some other government organization, and there's more scrutiny on it. Now, one other factor is that many employees in an organization are bypassing corporate IT standards. A lot of standards, especially in a regulated industry, companies really put up firewalls, they put up security because they want their data to remain secure. They're concerned about what publicity to privately held data could do to them, especially in a regulated industry like healthcare or financial services or even government. We've all heard about Snowden and what he did to our defense. Anyway, depending on the size of the company, some studies show, and this is a study by Osterman Research, how a company with, say, up to 100 employees, approximately 21% of the employees, so let's just say, and I'm rounding here, 21 people out of every 100 people are basically taking data off of the company's site to Dropbox. Why are they doing this? It's because they want the mobility. They want to be able to access their data on their devices whenever they want to, no matter wherever they are. And it's inconvenient to use a VPN. Now, the numbers grow and the larger the organization. So, for example, the next step up to 1,000 employees, all of a sudden that number jumps by over 10% to 31.4%. And then when you get to an even larger organization, the number jumps again. So depending on the size of the organization, whether or not you agree with this data, what it tells you is that a lot of people, without the blessing of IT, is taking the personal files and moving them to a public cloud where they're less secure so that they have more activity, more capability to work on these files and get their job done, maybe outside normal business hours, or maybe when they're on the road traveling as part of their business. So essentially, what this means is data is leaking. So data is moved to the cloud, and when it's in the cloud, it may not be backed up because, you know, when a company has a data center or even just a data closet, they have backup tools. Whether it's Symantec, Veeam, something else, they have the ability to back up their data. But when an employee moves that data to the cloud without IT's knowledge, any changes to those files are kept in the cloud and on an employee's personal device. You know, maybe a file's emailed to other people, but it's not formally backed up. Also, downstream, a company has no idea who's seeing this data, and therefore it could expose them to litigation or at least some press that they're not looking for, which could hurt them, especially if they're a publicly traded company. And data flows out of the company and it flows through the firewall, and it really defeats the purpose of the firewall because the employees, as we've already mentioned, are bypassing the security systems put in place by IT to protect the data and the company. So that brings the question up, so what are businesses doing today to stop that? Well, we're looking here at some research done by Enterprise Strategy Group, and they're a well-known industry analyst. And basically what they're saying is that enterprises really want to give employees the kind of mobility and data access that the employees are looking for. But they want to host on their own premises. They want to give a cloud solution hosted within their data centers or their colos, somewhere where they have control. And what this means then is, according to Enterprise Strategy Group, that 70% of the enterprises are extremely interested in running cloud storage solutions, but from their own data centers. Essentially, they would like to create a private cloud that is really secure and doesn't go to the public cloud providers like Box or Dropbox or some of the other ones out there. And they're also really interested in, you know, almost 97% are really interested in doing it in their own data center. So again, whether or not you believe these statistics, it's a high, either 2/3 or almost everybody wants to stop this leaking to the public cloud of corporate data. Now, there are several reasons why enterprises want to run their own cloud service. One is, if it's in their own data center, then they have the flexibility and control over where data is stored. Because if it's placed in a Dropbox or a Box kind of situation, you really don't know where the data is. You don't know how secure it is, hence the headlines I shared with you. You don't know if it's being backed up, and you don't know who can see it downstream. And this is a very big concern to companies of all sizes. But if you know where it's located, you can back it up, you can make sure it's secure, and you don't have those concerns about what happens to your data downstream. Also, if the data is on-premise, then maybe you can leverage existing infrastructure because you've already made big investments in this infrastructure and you want to get your maximum value out of it, even if the product's fully depreciated. And you can go through and see some of these other reasons why people want to shift to an on-premise solution versus putting it in the cloud. One of the other big reasons, and this is actually the bottom of this table, is it used to be that people felt they were spending too much money on CapEx. And so they wanted to shift purchases more to a subscription model and turn it more into OpEx, which made public cloud solutions, which are mostly subscription-driven, very interesting and desirable. However, what's happened is nowadays products like Dropbox and Box and others, they charge you for the subscription per user, and they also charge you for storage. Well, if you have, less than 10 users, maybe that's not a big deal. It's a bit like your cable TV bill. But when you start talking about hundreds or even thousands of employees and terabytes or possibly petabytes of data, all of a sudden this is hugely expensive. And so the CapEx model is now becoming more favored over the OpEx model. And so there's a shift underway. So that's a little bit about the background. Let's take a moment now and talk about Connected Data's product, Transporter. So what is Transporter? Well, first of all, it's a private appliance that you buy and deploy within your data center. It provides mobile infrastructure, just like Dropbox does, but it's really a secure alternative to Dropbox because it gives you mobile access to your data. It gives you the enterprise file sync and share capabilities. If you have more than one transporter, they can be configured as a scalable solution or as a replicated solution for disaster recovery. And an administrator can establish these rules and policies on deployment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in this presentation. But also, it can integrate with existing infrastructure. So if you have an existing NAS machine, and that could be a NetApp machine running ONTAP, or maybe a Windows Server 2008 or later based storage system, we can create a path and share some of the folders and the contents of those folders with users, which will breathe new life into your existing NAS machine. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. When you deploy Transporter, you deploy in a non-disruptive method. So any current systems and processes you have in-house, they remain unaltered. This is an addition to what you already have, and it provides a lot more capabilities and that kind of public cloud user experience that your in-house users really want, that we were talking about earlier. It gives you much higher capacity and performance than the public cloud storage solutions, and because it's a buy and own, not a subscription-based model, you don't have the same cost structure as you do with a Dropbox or a box. So that makes it dramatically less expensive than a public cloud storage solution. In fact, the break-even, and we've done some statistics on this, break-even can be anywhere as quickly as 10 months. On average, it's more like a year for a break-even subscription versus capital equipment cost. And one of the most important things, it's 100% private. Now, as I mentioned, you can connect to existing NAS machines, and I said I'd go a little bit more into this. So basically, Transporter, if you expose the sys, so any storage system that exposes the sys shares, we can, from Transporter, create a path to that, in this case, a NetApp filer. That's what the image is here. Once you do that, the path will determine which folder you're looking at. It can be on one, or you can have multiple paths to the same NetApp filer or NAS solution, or you can have paths to multiple NetApp filers. Once you do that, the folder that you're pathed is replicated on the Transporter device. And then there's as you can see from the green arrow here, there's a bidirectional synchronization that takes place. So any changes made on the files on Transporter are synchronized with the files on the NetApp device or the Windows Server. And any changes made through a VPN to the NetApp device, they will also be synchronized with the same files on Transporter. That means then the files within the folder are always in sync, and always you see the latest versions of these files. Now, going beyond the firewall here on this image, your users, whether they're in a company environment or whether or not they're mobile users, they will have access to these files within a folder, because the way Transporter works is people will invite other people to share the contents of these folders. And once you accept an email invitation to share, you will have access to these files, and they will be transparent. They will appear like they're local on your device. You won't have to log in. You won't have to go through a VPN. So you'll have access to your files and folders, even though they may be in a remote device, but they will appear local to you. So you can access them anywhere at any time you need them to be. So really you're getting the public cloud experience, but coming from a private cloud appliance that your company owns. Also, one other thing before I leave this slide, because it's an on-premise solution, some of the things that you couldn't accomplish with a public cloud solution like Dropbox is the ability to do backups. Here, if you want to do additional backups, you can certainly do that with Veeam, Symantec, or anything. Again, these backup products or Commvault, they use the CIFS shares to do the backup. So that's part of the 100% non-destructive that we talked about in the previous slide. Now, from a deployment perspective, what we have here is kind of a diagram where you could have, if you have lots of different offices, you could have a couple of transporters at a corporate headquarters office here. They can either be standalone devices because they come with their own storage, and the transporters themselves are RAID devices. So it's a storage array in its own right, and should there be a drive failure, the RAID will ensure that your data doesn't get lost because you had a hard disk go bad on you. But also, as you can see from the far right of this image, we connect to a NAS device, and that's what I was talking about in the previous slide, where you can create a path, and that's an administrative function to share folders. And then once people are invited, they can access the folders anywhere in the world at any time. But as I mentioned, if you have a lot of different offices, you could also put transporters in some of the other offices. So here on the bottom left of this slide, where we see branch office, this gives you the capability of replicating a transporter and maybe even replicating a NAS machine here. So now you have a disaster recovery solution. You also notice that on the top right here, we have partners and clients, and we have telecommuting on the bottom right here. The point is that users and partners can access the data from anywhere. Now, there's two different types of user. One is an organizational user. An organizational user is somebody who has read-write privileges, and they can invite other people to share their folders. You don't need to go to an administrator and ask an administrator to set up the sharing. You, as a folder owner, can invite people to share your folder. Now, if you invite another organizational user, the other organizational users will have read-write privileges as well. But for partners and clients, for example, you may want to invite them as guest users, and that's another type of user. A guest user has read-only privileges, so they can see the files, they can upload files, but they can't modify files. And of course, in this kind of setup, there is an administrator as well. But mostly, Transporter is a self-managed by the users themselves. It requires very little administration overhead. Now, I've been talking about pathing and integrating with existing storage systems. So let's double click on that a little bit deeper. So I'll show you at the end of this presentation what our product line looks like. But all of our rack mount products, of which we have 3, that's a Transporter 75, Transporter 150, and Transporter 500, they can all create a path to a NAS storage system. And they're located traditionally in the data center behind the firewall. And from them, mobile users can access the transporter and the files on the existing storage system through that path. But as I mentioned already, there's no requirement for a VPN, there's no requirement to log in. The files and folders will appear local to the device that you're using in your job. Now, I mentioned that in the earlier slide about Transporter can be replicated in branch offices for a disaster recovery solution. So the more transporters you have more replication. However, you can also add transporters to scale. So one of the things is, I mentioned earlier that we have this concept of organizational users. Now, the Transporter 75 supports 75 organizational users and an unlimited number of guest users. Transporter 150 supports 150 organizational users and an unlimited number of guest users. And the Transporter 500 supports 500 organizational users and, again, unlimited number of guest users. And one of the organizational users would be an administrator. So let's just say you have a couple of hundred users. What product do you deploy? Well, you could start off with a Transporter 75, and then you could add maybe another a Transporter 150, which gives you 225 users. And so in this image on this slide at headquarters, the 2 transporters could be supporting 200 or up to 225 organizational users, and the one at the branch office could be a replicated 75 as an example. Transporter enables secure sharing. Now, we talked a little bit earlier on the slide with the picture of the globe about how you can extend this solution to partners and clients as guest users. Now, a partner, what I didn't mention was a guest user does not have the ability to invite other guest users. So if you're concerned about the data downstream leaving your domain, then, and you want to open up your files in a collaboration situation, that's fine. But guest users who may be partners, who may be clients, they don't have the capability of inviting other people to share folders. So they get to share the folders, they can access the data in a read-only state, they can upload files, and this is especially useful, for example, if you're in the construction industry, or maybe you're in real estate industry where you take videos and you upload videos from a walkthrough. These are all great things to do. So it's very collaborative, but IT always has control of where the data is. And we also have something called audit logs. And so from an audit log perspective, if you want to recreate a scenario, if something happened, an administrator can look at the audit logs and know what happened, who did what to what file from what device and when they did it. So you can really lay out a sequence of events here between partners and employees as well. Now, I've made several references so far about how files appear to be local to the user. Now, what I haven't mentioned is the devices we support. So from a mobility perspective, we support Microsoft Windows, we support Macs, we support iPad, and iPhone as well as Android phones. So we support really most of the popular devices. Now, when you open up a folder for sharing, and it doesn't matter if it just resides on Transporter or if it resides on an in-house legacy NAS storage system, the folders themselves will show up on your directory as if they're local. And you'll see on this slide, this happens to be a Mac. It happens to be using Finder, but it could equally be Internet Explorer on a, not Internet Explorer, Windows Explorer on a PC. And the files would show up just as you see them here with little icons. And the little icons you can see in the left-hand corner of some of these folders show that they're being shared. And they're replicated on Transporter. This means then that users can use a traditional in-house storage system front-ended by a Transporter, and the Transporter will enable an in-house legacy system to give the user every public cloud benefit that they would expect if they went directly to a Dropbox or a box. Also, we expose the APIs so that third-party apps can be created. We do the synchronization of important files and folders, just like Dropbox does. We also sync with the personal devices. You know, nowadays we seem to bring our own device to work, and that doesn't matter. We also create access to files in the cloud from the mobile devices. It doesn't matter if you're sitting in an airplane seat before takeoff. You can still have access to your files on your cell phone. You also have the ability to access terabytes, maybe petabytes even, of files over the internet. But it's not as slow because we don't actually do, we have a peer-to-peer network, and I'll show you that in a coming slide, which is increasing performance. One of the problems of a public cloud solution is every read and every write has to go up to the cloud and then down again, where we have a peer-to-peer network, which is a lot faster, especially for large files like video files. So let's talk a little bit about the technology and how we do this. How does it work? So I'm sure everyone on the call knows about Skype. Skype essentially uses existing infrastructure, but you use the infrastructure, or internet infrastructure if you like, using your own personal devices. Well, Transporter works in a similar way, and this really cuts down the costs of the solution. So in this image on the left, what you see here are a couple of rack mount transporters, and you see a nice black line between them. So that's part of the peer-to-peer network. And as you see, there's another transporter by the house. That's not a rack mount one, that's a tabletop version of the transporter, and that would be a 15 or 30 user transporter. Could be used for a departmental or a small business. And then you have the mobile devices. Now, what we have then is we use existing infrastructure to transfer data, and it's really at no cost to either the customer or connected data. So that's a bit like Skype because they're using the existing infrastructure. As I've already mentioned, the data never leaves the customer's control because it's an on-premise solution. It's 100% private. In fact, the way we set it up is that people on the internet actually can't see a transporter when it's sitting on the internet because the MAC address and the IP address are hidden, making it a private network. As we move data between the devices, we don't go to the cloud, we move data backwards and forwards to the devices. We use the serial numbers of the devices, which really reduces the ability of a third party to hack into our system. It's almost impossible. Now, we do have in the web a management interface where people can go to the management interface and make some changes to users or to access data or links. So you can actually send somebody a link in an email to the location of a file instead of sending them a large file. Many email tools can't handle very large files. They either bounce back or something gets lost, kind of goes into a bit bucket. In this situation, you don't actually have to send the email file. You send a link to the file on Transporter. And then you can make sure, using the management interface, that the link is only good for a certain period of time, and then the link itself becomes unusable. So that's another security method. Now, a lot of organizations, especially ones using NAS machines, will use Active Directory. So I've been talking a lot about creating paths between in-house storage devices, and I just exposed the fact that we have a web interface as well. What I haven't mentioned is Transporter's ability to use Active Directory. So in larger organizations, we really want to provision and deprovision users based on their credentials handled or held on an Active Directory server. And we can do that. And a lot of companies also use a single sign-on solution. So at a high-level diagram here, what we have is an Active Directory domain controller that's usually on a server within the data center. Then there's an identity provider, and they have an agent on a Windows server. And then going up into the cloud, you have basically a single sign-on. Some people use one login, some people use Okta, there's Centrify as well. There's a lot of different ones there. We actually today use one login. In the not too distant future, we'll also be using Okta, and we have we will actually extend that to more providers. So therefore, users or an administrator with a lot of users in their domain, they can connect Transporter to the Active Directory servers, and users will be provisioned and deprovisioned based on Active Directory. Now this is really important because let's just say that an employee of your company has been loyal employee, good guy, person, whatever. They've been taking data and using it locally on the mobile devices here on the right-hand side of the slide. Well, if they resign, leave the company, something happens, you really want to keep their work, but you really don't want them to have access to the data anymore. So when Active Directory is told that a person is leaving the organization, Transporter stops syncing with that person's device. Now, any data or any files which they've taken locally onto their device, it goes into a container. When Transporter stops syncing with that device, there's a small app that you download onto the device, and that app recognizes that the syncing has stopped, and any files on that app will be remotely wiped. Therefore, when Active Directory stops provisioning that user and starts to deprovision that user, all your files within the container are remote wiped. And it's not just, you flag it as deleted. We actually write zeros over the top of the data. Therefore, it's completely unusable again. And that's a really big security feature. Also, when you add new users, then to Active Directory, then an account on Transporter is created, and so those users are now open to be invited to sharing without having to create an account on Transporter. This is all automated, it's all transparent to the user, and it really adds a level of security that the public cloud providers don't have. So if we look at a service comparison based on all of this, I'm not going to go through all the items here, but basically There are some features here that Dropbox doesn't have, and different features that NetApp doesn't have, or Windows storage server. Connected data has all of these features and more. The point is that connected data's transporter products are a very complete and rich product portfolio. And what I didn't mention on the how it works slide is also we encrypt the data as it moves between the devices. So it's really hard to get access to the data in flight. I mentioned earlier that I would share our product matrix with you, and so here it is. The two columns on the right are, departmental or work group type appliances. One of them is the Transporter 15, which has 15 organizational users, including the administrator and an unlimited number of guest users. And the one next to it, the Transporter 30, has 30 organizational users. And you can see that that's our numbering system as you move further and further to the left. One of the other things you'll see is that each transporter on the third row here, the larger the transporter, the larger the capacity. Now, in order to add capacity, whether it's user capacity or storage capacity, you simply add another transporter, and that will add both users and storage capacity. So it's a very scalable solution. You basically pay as you grow. Also, we mentioned all the rack mount units are NAS capable, and all of the products are RAIDed arrays. So just to summarize this discussion, and then we'll go to Q&A. There's a lot of value for the customer. There's a lot of value for the hosting company or the owner. But from a customer perspective, it breathes new life into existing NAS systems. Some of these in-house NAS systems have been around for a long time, and users are frustrated with them because they're not the easiest, especially if you're a mobile user, which takes me to the second bullet, and that's about the VPN. So as I've shown you, we dispense with the VPN, and so there's no login, but you're very, very secure. It really does deliver, Transporter really does deliver the Dropbox or public cloud experience that users are really demanding today, because it gives them the flexibility to access their data at any time, anywhere. Now, I haven't mentioned that we have version control as well, which means then that we keep, when a file is created, we keep the delta of the file changes between the different versions. And that means then that when multiple people are accessing the same files in a collaborative way and they're all updating it, every time somebody changes a file and then saves it to disk, we will create a new file. So you can roll back the versions, which is very, very useful. It's 100% non-disruptive to existing applications and processes. We really give the control back to the IT organization. So they have full security over the data. They don't have to worry about some of the company exposure downstream because of their employees who are well-meaning but take files out of the security of the enterprise and move them up to the public cloud. And as we've mentioned, it's an inexpensive solution that's easy to deploy.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony, for your presentation. So we're going to pause here for questions that have been popping up throughout the webinar. One common question here is for you, Tony. How do you suggest backing up a transporter?
So transporter, let's just assume it's not attached to an existing NAS machine. It's a standalone storage device in its own right. We expose the CIFS shares, and so any backup solution that uses the CIFS shares can be used to back up transporter. Alternatively, of course, you can replicate transporter so you have a copy of everything there.
All right, great. Which NAS platforms are certified with Connector?
So if we start with NetApp, ONTAP version 7 or greater. I think we're at 10, maybe later than that. But so NetApp ONTAP version 7 or later, or Windows Server 2008 or later.
All right. So we're talking about scalability. So we talked about this a little bit about the 500. If a customer requires more than 150 users, can the product scale?
And yeah, we did talk about the scaling of capacity and users. Now, you talked about 150 users. Now, maybe a transporter 500 is too big a step. If you have something less than 500, you may want to deploy either transporter 75, another transporter 150, or even a 15 and a 30. So basically, you simply add transporters to add organizational users and capacity. Of course, you could always go to a 500, and beyond 500, again, the same scenario. You can just keep adding transporters to scale capacity and users.
All right. How does transporter handle multiple people changing the same file?
Well, I talked about this as part of the summary in the versioning. Now, what I didn't mention there, so I suggested that if multiple people are changing the file and saving it at the same time, a version will be created for each time a file is saved. That way users can roll back to earlier versions. Now, if somebody is changing, let's just say somebody is changing a file on a NAS machine with a VPN, and at the very same instance somebody on transporter is saving a file, then the priority will be given to the one on the NAS machine. That will then be synced with transporter, and then the one that was saved on transporter will be given a higher version number. And the other thing I didn't mention is that we don't do compression or deduplication on transporter. What we do, the versioning saves the disk space for us.
All right. We have a question on mobile use. Does a mobile user need to have an active internet connection to view files, or can certain files be cached locally for viewing without an active internet connection?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. So initially, you do need an internet connection to get the file onto your mobile device, but then they are cached in that container that I was talking about, and so you can work offline from files within the container. Any changes you make will be then, using that peer-to-peer network, will then be synchronized as soon as possible when a network connection is created. So you do need a LAN, but you don't necessarily need a WAN.
Okay. What happens when an employee leaves an organization? Can you talk about the remote wipeability?
Yeah, again, I touched on this earlier. So it doesn't matter if you're using Active Directory or not using Active Directory. So if you're not using Active Directory, when somebody is invited to share a folder, they will be asked to create an account. And that will give a lot of the details about the devices they use. If they are using Active Directory, then the account is automatically created. Now, in either case, you can disinvite somebody. So when you have Active Directory, the deprovisioning takes place based on the changes in the Active Directory database. But if you don't have Active Directory, you send a disinvitation, or you rescind the invitation for sharing. And when you do that, synchronization between transporter and the person's devices stops, and that's when a remote wipe takes place and everything in the container is overwritten with zeros. Now, we don't actually turn the device into a brick. So everything outside of that container is left alone. So any other personal data that you might have on your device, especially if you're using a personal device in a business environment like a cell phone, that will remain untouched. So I hope that answers the question for you.
All right, great. We have several questions on the syncing ability. Can you talk a little bit more about different accounts and how syncing works for different users?
So yes. Guest users don't really sync in the same way. Guest users, because guest users aren't allowed to write data, they can read data. There's less synchronization that needs to take place, but the way Transporter works is there's an app that you download onto your personal device. So you have Transporter, and then you have an app. And so whatever device you're using, whether it's Android, Windows, iPad, whatever, you download an app. That app will create the container, and it will host the syncing capability. As I mentioned just a moment ago, when syncing stops, then the app will do the remote wipe on the local device. That's technically how it works. Now, for people who have already been using Transporter, we had originally an Active Directory connector, so you could import, and recently we have full integration with Active Directory. Now, if you are an earlier Transporter user, you have to start with a clean Transporter in order to do full Active Directory integration, because there is a setup process. Setup's really easy, but you don't want to overwrite anything. So going back to the synchronization, organizational users read-write synchronization happens transparently to the user, and guest users have the ability to have read-only, but they really can't download data for use on their own personal devices. I hope that sort of addresses the questions there.
Great, thank you so much, Tony. So we're going to wrap things up here. If you have any further questions, please go ahead and contact us at sales@connecteddata.com to speak with the sales rep. And we will record this session, so if you want to refer back to this, we'll have this posted in the near future on our website. So thank you again for joining today. Bye-bye.